The cemetery was quiet, shrouded in the soft golden glow of the setting sun. Emily walked between the gravestones, her steps slow, her thoughts heavier than the air around her. She wasn't sure why she had come here. Maybe it was the way her life had spiraled out of control recently. Or maybe it was the simple need for silence, a place where no one expected her to be strong. The world outside felt too loud, too fast, and here, at least, time seemed to hold its breath. She didn't notice the grave at first. It was tucked under an old oak tree, its bark scarred and twisted like the lines on an ancient map. The gravestone was small and unmarked except for a single line carved deep into the weathered stone. "For those who seek truth, listen closely if you dare." Emily stopped, her heart skipping a beat. There was something unsettling about the words, something that made her want to look away but kept her rooted in place. The wind picked up suddenly, carrying with it a faint whisper that sent a chill racing up her spine. She turned her head, her eyes scanning the empty graveyard, but no one was there. She shook her head, telling herself it was just the wind, but the sound lingered, a soft murmur just at the edge of her hearing, almost as if the grave was trying to speak to her. She knelt down, brushing the dirt away from the base of the stone, hoping to find a clue about who was buried there. But there was nothing. No name, no date, just the eerie message. It didn't make sense. Why would someone leave a grave unmarked except for words meant to unsettle anyone who passed by? She looked around again, her unease growing. The graveyard was still empty, but it felt as though the shadows themselves were watching her. Emily stood, brushing the dirt from her hands, and stepped back. But something wouldn't let her leave. It was like the grave was pulling her in, daring her to understand its secret. She looked at the tree above it, its branches swaying in a way that felt unnatural in the still air. Her mind raced with questions she couldn't answer, and the more she tried to shake them, the stronger they clung to her. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, breaking the spell. She pulled it out, glancing at the screen. A message from a friend, asking where she was. She typed back a quick reply, her hands trembling slightly, then slipped the phone back into her pocket. She turned to leave, but as she did, the whisper came again, clearer this time. Her name. Emily froze, her breath catching in her throat. It wasn't possible. She didn't believe in ghosts or the supernatural, but hearing her name whispered in a graveyard by an unseen voice wasn't something she could easily explain away. She turned back to the grave, her heart pounding. She didn't know what she was supposed to do or why this was happening, but one thing was clear. She couldn't walk away. Not yet. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that the grave wanted her to stay. She crouched down again, this time running her fingers over the engraved words. The texture felt rough, almost as if the letters had been scratched into the stone by hand. As her fingers brushed over the final word, a chill spread through her body, sharp and sudden, as if she had touched something alive. She pulled her hand back and stood, glancing around once more. The graveyard was still deserted, but now it felt different, like it was holding its breath. She decided to take a picture of the gravestone. Maybe she could search online or ask someone who might know more. As she raised her phone, the screen flickered for a moment before shutting off completely. She frowned, pressing the power button, but it refused to turn back on. Annoyed, she shoved it into her jacket pocket, muttering to herself about old batteries. But deep down, she felt a prickle of unease. It wasn't just the phone, it was everything. The whispers, the strange energy around the grave, and the way her own name had echoed in the air. Determined not to let her imagination run wild, Emily turned and started walking back toward the cemetery gates. She hadn't gone far when she heard it again. A soft, almost pleading whisper. This time it wasn't just her name. The voice was faint, barely audible, but she could swear it said, "Please, don't leave." She stopped in her tracks, her pulse quickening. It wasn't real. It couldn't be real. And yet, something about the voice felt desperate, as if whoever or whatever it belonged to was terrified of being abandoned again. She turned around slowly, her eyes locking on the grave under the oak tree. The wind had died down completely now, and the silence was suffocating. Her feet moved before her brain could catch up, taking her back to the grave. She knelt down again, brushing more dirt away from the base of the stone. This time her fingers hit something hard. She hesitated for a moment, then dug deeper, pulling out a small metal object. It was an old tin box, rusted and caked with dirt. The lid was sealed tightly, but the weight of it felt heavy in her hands, as though it held more than just forgotten trinkets. Emily's breath quickened as she pried the box open. Inside, she found a locket and a photograph, worn and faded with age. The photo showed a young girl with dark hair and a shy smile, standing in front of what looked like an old building. On the back of the photo, written in shaky handwriting, were the words, Eva. 1953. Her fingers trembled as she picked up the locket. It was small and simple, shaped like a heart. When she opened it, she found a single word etched inside. Truth. Emily's mind raced. Who was Eva? Was she the one buried here? And why would her grave be left unmarked, her identity erased except for these cryptic clues? The sun had almost disappeared now, the shadows stretching longer across the cemetery. Emily knew she should leave, but something wouldn't let her go. The whispers were gone, but the air around her felt heavier, charged with a strange, unspoken urgency. She slipped the photograph and locket into her pocket and stood, staring down at the grave. Whatever truth Eva had wanted to share, Emily could feel it pressing against her, demanding to be heard. She glanced at the cemetery gates in the distance. She could leave, pretend none of this had happened, and move on with her life. But as she looked back at the grave, she knew she wouldn't be able to forget it. Not until she knew the story. Not until she knew the truth. Emily barely slept that night. The photograph and locket sat on her nightstand, their presence pulling her thoughts back to the graveyard. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Ava's faint smile from the photo, and she heard the whispers again. They weren't threatening, they were pleading. By dawn, Emily knew she couldn't ignore this. Something about Ava's story needed to be uncovered, and she felt like she had been chosen, for reasons she couldn't yet explain. Her first stop was the local library. It was old and underfunded, the kind of place most people forgot existed. She found herself at the archives desk asking about records from 1953. The librarian, an elderly woman with a kind but tired face, raised an eyebrow at the request. Not much left from that time, she said, leading Emily to a room filled with dusty filing cabinets. Most of the records were destroyed years ago. Emily thanked her and started sifting through the drawers. The process was slow and tedious, but eventually she found what she was looking for. A file labeled Willow Creek Orphanage Fire. Her pulse quickened as she pulled it out. She had heard of the fire before, a tragedy that had claimed the lives of several children and staff members, but she had never paid much attention to it. Now, holding the file, she felt an unsettling connection. Inside, the papers were yellowed and fragile. The ink faded in places. The official report stated that the fire had started in the middle of the night due to faulty wiring. It was deemed an accident, a tragedy that no one could have prevented. But as Emily flipped through the pages, she found something that didn't add up. A list of names, children and staff who had died in the fire. Ava's name wasn't on it. She frowned, reading the list again. The name wasn't there, but there was a note at the bottom of the page. One unidentified body recovered. No record found. Emily's heart sank. Could that have been Ava? Was she the one buried in the unmarked grave? If so, why was her name missing from the records? Digging deeper, she found an old newspaper clipping tucked into the file. It showed a photograph of the orphanage before the fire, its grand facade now hauntingly familiar. It was the same building Ava had stood in front of in the photograph from the tin box. Beneath the photo was an article about the orphanage director, a man named Charles Whitaker, who had received a substantial insurance payout after the fire. Emily's stomach twisted as she read on. There were accusations of neglect, children left without proper care, dangerous conditions ignored, but nothing had ever come of them. Whitaker had died a few years later, taking whatever secrets he held with him. She leaned back in her chair, the weight of it all pressing down on her. Ava wasn't just another victim of a tragic fire. There was more to this, something buried as deeply as her grave. And whoever had buried her had made sure her story would be forgotten. But now Emily had the locket, the photograph, and the whispers that refused to be silenced. Her thoughts were interrupted by the librarian's voice. "Find what you were looking for?" the woman asked, peeking into the room. Emily hesitated before nodding. I think so, but it's only the beginning. As she left the library, her mind raced with questions. Why was Ava erased from history? What truth had she tried to reveal? And why did Emily feel like the grave had chosen her to uncover it? She clutched the locket in her pocket, the word etched inside, now feeling like a promise she couldn't break. Emily's next stop was the town hall. She needed more than speculation, something concrete that could tie Ava to the orphanage and explain why her name had been wiped from history. The clerk at the records office was less than helpful, brushing off her questions with a dismissive shrug. Anything from back then is probably in storage, if it even exists, he said, not bothering to hide his disinterest. Frustrated but undeterred, Emily decided to search the archives herself. The basement was damp and poorly lit, filled with stacks of unorganized boxes that smelled of mildew. Hours passed as she combed through old documents, her fingers smudged with dust and ink. She was on the verge of giving up when she found it. A folder marked Willow Creek Orphanage Incident Reports. Her heart raced as she opened it. Inside was a collection of handwritten notes, some barely legible, detailing complaints filed against the orphanage in the months leading up to the fire. The accusations were chilling: physical abuse, children going missing, and rumors of illegal activities involving the orphanage's director, Charles Whitaker. One report stood out, filed just 2 weeks before the fire. It mentioned a young girl named Ava who had been caught sneaking into Whitaker's office late at night. The details were sparse, but the note concluded ominously. Ava claims to have evidence. Situation to be addressed immediately. Emily's hands trembled as she read the words. Evidence of what? And had Ava been silenced because of it? The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fit together, but the picture they formed was far darker than Emily had imagined. She carefully folded the document and slipped it into her bag, knowing she was stepping into dangerous territory. On her way out, she stopped to catch her breath, leaning against the cold, damp wall of the basement. Her mind was spinning with the implications. If Ava had found something incriminating, it could explain why her grave was unmarked, her name erased. But who had buried her? And why leave such an eerie message on the gravestone, almost as if daring someone to uncover the truth? As Emily climbed the stairs back to the main floor, she noticed the lights flickering. She paused, her heart pounding. The air felt heavier, colder, as though the basement itself was reacting to her discovery. She quickened her pace, emerging into the relative safety of the main hall. The clerk barely glanced at her as she hurried past, his disinterest a small comfort in the moment. Outside, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the town square. Emily felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. She gripped her bag tightly, her thoughts racing. Ava's story was more than a tragedy. It was a warning, and Emily had only scratched the surface. As she walked back to her apartment, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The whispers from the graveyard seemed to echo in her mind, growing louder with each step. She looked over her shoulder, but the streets were empty. Still, the sense of unease followed her all the way home, settling into the corners of her mind like a shadow that refused to leave. Once inside, she locked the door and sat at her desk, spreading out everything she had gathered so far: the photograph, the locket, the documents. Together, they painted a picture of a young girl who had been silenced to protect a secret, a truth that someone had gone to great lengths to bury. Emily knew she couldn't stop now, not when she was so close to uncovering what Ava had died for. Her phone buzzed, breaking her concentration. She glanced at the screen. It was a text from an unknown number. "You're digging in places you shouldn't. Stop before it's too late." Emily's blood ran cold. Whoever had sent the message knew what she was doing. But instead of fear, she felt a surge of determination. Ava's voice, faint but persistent, echoed in her mind. The truth was waiting, and Emily wasn't about to stop now. Emily stared at the message on her phone, her heart pounding in her chest. Her fingers hovered over the screen, debating whether to reply. The message wasn't just a warning, it was a threat. Someone out there knew she was digging into Ava's story, and they wanted her to stop. She locked the phone and set it aside, refusing to let fear cloud her focus. Ava's whispers had drawn her into this, and now it felt less like a choice and more like a responsibility. She spent the night piecing together everything she knew so far: The locket, the photograph, the documents, they all pointed to a girl who had uncovered something dangerous and paid the ultimate price for it. But there was still one piece missing, the evidence Ava had claimed to have. Emily knew it had to be out there, hidden, waiting for someone to find it. The thought kept her awake long into the night. The next morning, Emily returned to the cemetery. She hadn't planned to, but something about the unmarked grave felt like a magnet pulling her in. The whispers had stopped, but the grave itself still held an eerie energy. She knelt by the stone, her fingers tracing the carved words once more. "For those who seek truth, listen closely if you dare." This time she noticed something she hadn't seen before. At the base of the gravestone, partially hidden by dirt and moss, was a small symbol etched into the stone, a crescent moon overlapping a key. It wasn't random, it was deliberate, almost like a clue. Emily quickly snapped a picture of it with her phone, which, to her surprise, worked perfectly now. Her curiosity led her to the town's historical society, a quiet building tucked away near the edge of the town square. Inside, an older man named Mr. Calloway greeted her. He was the kind of person who seemed to know everything about the town's past, and Emily hoped he might recognize the symbol. When she showed him the photo, his expression changed. The color drained from his face, and he leaned back in his chair, suddenly tense. "Where did you find this?" he asked, his voice sharp. Emily hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. "At the cemetery," she said carefully. "On an unmarked grave." Mr. Calloway sighed and rubbed his temples. "That symbol. It's connected to a group that used to operate in this town. Secretive, dangerous people. They called themselves the Crescent Order. They were involved in some questionable activities, but most of it was covered up. If this is on a grave, it means whoever's buried there knew something they weren't supposed to." Emily felt a chill run through her. The Crescent Order. The name sounded ominous, like something pulled straight out of a conspiracy novel. "What kind of activities?" she pressed. Mr. Calloway hesitated. "Smuggling, bribery, worse things. They had influence in places that should have been untouchable. People who crossed them didn't last long." He glanced at her, his eyes narrowing. "If you've found something tied to them, you need to be very careful. They're not the kind of people who leave loose ends." The warning made her stomach twist, but it only strengthened her resolve. She thanked him and left, her mind racing with possibilities. The Crescent Order might have been involved in the orphanage fire, and Ava could have been the key to exposing them. Was that why she was silenced? Emily returned home to find her apartment door slightly ajar. Her pulse spiked as she pushed it open, her breath catching at the sight of her living room. Papers were scattered across the floor, drawers left open, and her laptop was missing. Someone had been here, and they hadn't been subtle about it. Her first instinct was to call the police, but she stopped herself. Whoever had done this wasn't just trying to scare her. They were looking for something, and Emily knew exactly what it was. She rushed to her bedroom and checked the nightstand. The locket and photograph were still there, hidden under a loose floorboard she had placed them in earlier. Whoever had broken in hadn't found what they were looking for, but the message was clear. She was getting too close. As she sat on the floor, clutching the locket tightly, Emily made a decision. She couldn't stop now, not when Ava's story was so close to being uncovered. Her phone buzzed again, and she hesitated before looking at the screen. Another unknown number. This time the message read, "You've been warned. Stop now, or you'll end up just like her." Emily's grip tightened on the locket. The fear was real, but so was her determination. Ava's whispers had stopped, but Emily could feel the weight of her story pressing down on her. Someone didn't want the truth to come out, and that only made Emily more certain that it needed to. The fear clung to Emily like a shadow, but it wasn't enough to stop her. She spent the rest of the night combing through every piece of information she had gathered so far, looking for connections she might have missed. The photograph of Ava kept drawing her attention. The shy smile, the orphanage in the background, it was the only tangible glimpse she had of the girl whose story had been buried. But something about the photo felt incomplete. She flipped it over again, staring at the words scrawled on the back. Ava. Ayerete torlayerete aimbete mundre. They felt more like a clue than a simple caption. She grabbed a magnifying glass from her desk drawer and inspected the photo closely. Her breath caught when she noticed faint scratches near the edge of the image, almost invisible to the naked eye. It wasn't random damage. The scratches formed a shape, a crescent moon overlapping a key, the same symbol from the gravestone. Emily's pulse quickened. This wasn't just a photo, it was a message. She flipped open her laptop and searched for anything she could find about the Crescent Order. The deeper she dug, the darker the story became. They were rumored to have infiltrated various institutions in the town during the mid-20th century, including the orphanage. Whispers of child exploitation and illegal activities surrounded them, but no one had ever been able to prove it. Anyone who tried had mysteriously disappeared or been silenced. Emily leaned back in her chair, her mind spinning. Ava hadn't just stumbled onto a secret. She had been caught in the middle of a dangerous conspiracy. The scratches on the photo felt like Ava's last attempt to leave behind something that could expose the truth. The next day, Emily decided to visit the site of the old orphanage. It had been abandoned for decades, left to decay after the fire. The building was a crumbling skeleton, its charred walls overgrown with vines and moss. As she stepped inside, the air felt heavy, as though the place still carried the weight of what had happened there. She walked through the ruins, her footsteps echoing in the silence. The faint smell of ash lingered, even after all these years. She felt a strange pull toward what remained of the director's office, the room where Ava had supposedly been caught sneaking in. The door was barely hanging on its hinges and the floor creaked under her weight as she stepped inside. The room was empty except for a broken desk and a few scattered papers, their edges blackened by fire. She searched the desk, pulling out drawers and checking for hidden compartments. At first she found nothing, but then her fingers brushed against something cold and metallic wedged beneath the bottom drawer. It was a key. Her hands trembled as she held it up to the light. It was old and tarnished, with a small crescent moon engraved on the handle. This was it, the key Ava had risked everything for. Emily slipped it into her pocket, her mind racing. What did it unlock? And why had Ava hidden it here, knowing it might never be found? As she stood to leave, she felt the air shift around her. A faint sound, like a soft exhale, echoed through the room. Emily froze, her breath catching in her throat. She turned slowly, her eyes scanning the shadows. But nothing was there. And yet she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. The whispers returned, faint and fragmented, but unmistakable. This time they weren't calling her name. They were saying something else over and over, like a plea. Don't stop. Please don't stop. Emily swallowed hard, her fear warring with her determination. She clutched the key tightly in her hand and left the room, her footsteps quickening as she made her way back outside. The whispers faded as she stepped into the sunlight, but their urgency lingered in her mind. Back in her car, she stared at the key, turning it over in her hand. It was Ava's final clue, the last piece of the puzzle. Emily didn't know what it would unlock, but she knew one thing for certain. It was time to find out. Emily's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as she drove back to her apartment. The key rested in her pocket, its cold weight a constant reminder of how close she was to something huge. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Every shadow on the road, every car in her rearview mirror felt like a threat. But she didn't stop. She couldn't. When she arrived home, she double-checked the locks on her door before setting the key down on the table. It was small, unassuming, but the crescent moon engraved on its handle made it feel significant, almost sacred. She grabbed her laptop, determined to figure out what the key might unlock. She started with historical records of the orphanage and its surrounding properties, looking for anything that might hint at a hidden room, a safe, or something similar. Hours passed and frustration began to creep in. There were no mentions of secret compartments or hidden safes in any of the records. She leaned back, rubbing her temples, when a thought struck her. The locket. She retrieved it from her nightstand and opened it, staring at the word etched inside. Truth. She turned it over, inspecting every detail, and then noticed a small groove near the hinge, something she hadn't seen before. Her heart raced as she picked up the key and slid it into the groove. It fit perfectly. With a soft click, The back of the locket popped open, revealing a tiny folded piece of paper hidden inside. Emily unfolded it carefully, her hands trembling. The paper was fragile. The ink faded, but she could still make out the words. The basement. Beneath the floorboards. Hurry. Emily's breath hitched. The basement. It had to mean the orphanage. She grabbed her bag, the key, and the locket, and headed out the door without a second thought. The streets were eerily quiet as she drove back to the crumbling ruins of the orphanage, her mind racing with possibilities. Ava had left this clue for someone to find, knowing it might take years, or decades, for the right person to uncover it. And now, Emily was that person. When she arrived, the sky was a dull gray, the sun hidden behind thick clouds. The building looked even more menacing in the muted light, its charred walls standing like a monument to its dark past. She stepped inside, her footsteps echoing through the empty halls. The air was colder than before, and the silence felt oppressive, as if the building itself was holding its breath. She found the basement door at the end of a narrow hallway, its hinges rusted and broken. It took all her strength to pry it open, and when she did, a rush of damp, musty air hit her. The stairs creaked under her weight as she descended into the darkness, her flashlight cutting through the gloom. The basement was cluttered with debris, broken furniture, piles of ash, and the remnants of a life long forgotten. Emily scanned the floor, looking for anything that might hint at a hidden compartment. Her flashlight beam landed on a section of the floorboards that looked newer than the rest, as if they had been replaced long after the fire. Her pulse quickened as she knelt down and pried the boards loose, her hands shaking with anticipation. Beneath the floor was a metal box, its surface blackened by soot but otherwise intact. She pulled it out carefully and set it on the ground. The key fit perfectly into the lock, and with a deep breath she turned it. The lid creaked open, revealing a stack of papers, a few photographs, and a small leather-bound journal. Emily's hands trembled as she picked up the journal, flipping through its pages. The entries were written in a shaky but determined hand. They detailed everything Ava had witnessed at the orphanage, the abuse, the corruption, the Crescent Order's involvement. Ava had discovered that the orphanage was being used as a front for illegal activities, with the children being exploited in unimaginable ways. She had tried to gather evidence to expose the truth, but someone had found out. The last entry was cut short, the words trailing off mid-sentence. If you're reading this, please, don't let them bury the truth. Emily felt a lump rise in her throat as tears blurred her vision. Ava had died trying to do the right thing, trying to protect the other children. And now, decades later, Emily held the truth in her hands. But she also knew the danger wasn't over. The people who had silenced Ava once would do anything to keep their secrets buried. As she packed up the box and started back up the stairs, she heard it again, the whispers. This time they were louder, more urgent. She turned, her flashlight sweeping across the basement, but there was nothing there. And yet, the whispers grew stronger, forming a single, desperate plea. Run! Emily didn't hesitate. She bolted up the stairs and out of the building, her heart pounding as she raced to her car. The air felt heavier, the shadows deeper, as if something was chasing her. She didn't stop until she was back in her car, the metal box secured on the seat beside her. As she drove away, the whispers faded, leaving only silence in their wake. But Emily knew this was far from over. She had the evidence, but exposing it would come at a cost. The Crescent Order wouldn't let her go easily, and the truth Ava had died for was still dangerous. But as Emily gripped the wheel, her jaw set with determination, she knew one thing for certain. She wouldn't stop. Not now. Not ever. Emily barely slept that night. The box sat on her kitchen table, its contents spread out as she studied each piece of evidence. The photographs showed faces of children, their expressions hollow and haunting. The papers revealed financial transactions, names of prominent town figures, and cryptic codes that tied them all to the Crescent Order. Ava's journal was the most damning piece, her words painting a vivid picture of betrayal and fear. Emily felt her heart break for the girl who had carried so much only to be silenced before she could share it. But now the truth was out, at least in Emily's hands. She knew she couldn't keep it hidden. She needed to take it public. But that came with its own risks. The message on her phone still lingered in her mind, its warning clear. Stop. or face the same fate as Ava. The next morning, she reached out to a trusted contact, a former investigative journalist named Paul, who had worked on high-profile corruption cases. Paul was known for his relentless pursuit of justice, and if anyone could help her, it was him. They met in a small diner on the edge of town, away from prying eyes. Emily slid the journal across the table to Paul, her voice steady but low. This was hidden in the orphanage basement. It's Ava's story, but it's also proof. The Crescent Order was behind everything. Paul flipped through the journal, his face growing darker with each page. This is huge, he said finally. If this gets out, it'll tear this town apart. The people involved, they won't let this go quietly. I don't care, Emily said, her voice firm. Ava gave her life for this. She didn't have anyone to stand up for her, but now she does. They can't bury this anymore. Paul nodded, his expression grim but resolute. We'll need to move carefully. Get this into the hands of the right people. People who can't be bought or silenced. But you need to be ready for what's coming. As Emily drove home, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being followed. Her eyes darted to the rearview mirror, catching glimpses of a black car that seemed to stay just far enough behind to avoid suspicion. She took a few unexpected turns, testing her theory, and her stomach sank when the car mirrored her every move. Panic surged through her, but she forced herself to stay calm. Instead of heading to her apartment, she drove toward a busy shopping center, weaving through the parking lot until she lost sight of the black car. Her heart pounded as she finally parked and sat in silence, gripping the steering wheel tightly. That night, she received another message. We warned you. This is your last chance to walk away. Emily stared at the screen, her hands trembling. She knew this wasn't just a threat, it was a promise, but it didn't matter. Ava's voice was still with her, a quiet whisper of hope and determination. The truth wasn't just a burden, it was a weapon, and Emily intended to use it. The next day, Paul called her with an update. He had contacted a national news outlet, a team of investigative reporters who were willing to take on the story. They would verify the evidence, trace the connections, and expose the Crescent Order for what they had done. But there was one more thing Emily needed to do. She returned to the cemetery one last time, standing before Ava's grave under the old oak tree. The air was still, almost peaceful, as if the graveyard itself was waiting. Emily knelt, her fingers brushing the engraved words once more. For those who seek truth, listen closely, if you dare. I did it, Ava, she whispered, her voice breaking. They'll know what happened, they'll know what you went through, you're not forgotten anymore. For the first time, there were no whispers, no strange chills. The grave felt quiet, as if it had finally found peace. Emily stood, wiping her tears, and walked away, her steps lighter than they had been in days. The story broke a week later. The Crescent Order's network of corruption and abuse was laid bare, the evidence undeniable. Names that had once carried power were now synonymous with scandal, their legacies tarnished forever. The town was rocked to its core, but for the first time in decades, the silence had been broken.
Subscribe and press the bell icon so that you never miss the amazing video.